Plus, families complaining of rashes, headaches, and nausea. But are the symptoms actually linked to that toxic train wreck in East Palestine, Ohio? The head of the EPA is returning to East Palestine as the feds try to figure all this out.
And an arrest in the death of a Los Angeles Catholic bishop who was beloved. Who is the man in custody and what's his connection to the church leader? That's coming up.
But we do begin with the showdown on the world stage. Quite a morning already. Vladimir Putin and President Biden delivering dueling speeches this morning as we approach the one-year mark of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. We just heard Putin address the nation in Moscow. He condemned the United States and NATO countries for supplying weapons to the Ukrainians. He described them as, quote, terrorists, and he accused the West of starting the war.
Putin signaling there is no end to the war anytime soon. And hours from now, President Biden is slated to give his own speech here in Poland after that surprise trip to Kyiv yesterday, the middle of a war zone with no U.S. forces on the ground. Later this hour, he is scheduled to arrive at the presidential palace here in Warsaw to meet with Polish President Duda. All of this is coming at a critical and symbolic moment. The Ukrainians are begging for more and more weapons as the bloody conflict is dragging on with no end in sight. The big question right now that everyone here has, from Poland to Washington, is how long until the American public and European allies grow weary about sending billions of dollars worth of aid to Ukraine? CNN's Clarissa Ward is standing by live in Kyiv. But first this morning, we want to get to Fred Pleitgen, who is in Moscow, where President Putin has just finished that address. Fred, I know that Putin often saves, any announcements or news for the end of these speeches. What stood out to you?
Yeah, there certainly was the one announcement at the end of the speech. First of all, you're absolutely right, Caitlin. It was a very long speech that Vladimir Putin gave. And I would say that it was sort of subdivided into three different phases, where on the one hand, he said that Russia tried to do everything to prevent this war. However, it was, as he put it, the regime in Kiev that kept attacking Donbass. But I think one of the other important things that he said or kept saying is that he tried to make this into a conflict between Russia and the West, Russia, the U.S., and the U.S. rather than Russia and Ukraine, because it was clear to see that he doesn't even consider Ukraine to actually be a state. One of the other things that he also pointed out was the resilience, as he put it, of the Russian economy in the face of all this, obviously trying to portray that Russia is still going strong. But he did keep really the biggest announcement for the last part of it, saying that Russia is going to suspend its participation in the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Obviously, that is something that is pretty major. Both the U.S. and Russia have been trying to extend that treaty. It runs till 2026. It obviously sets caps on the amount of nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons that both countries are verifiably allowed to deploy. And I think one of the interesting things that we heard from Vladimir Putin is he said that he believes that the risk of allowing, for instance, U.S. inspectors or other inspectors onto their bases is that he's afraid they could get attacked by drones from Ukraine. So obviously likening that to the war in Ukraine as well. That was the sort of big major announcement. But really, on the whole, you could see Russia absolutely not willing to back down in any way, shape or form. Instead, Vladimir Putin really trying to mobilize Russians for a protracted special military operation, as he calls it, obviously the war in Ukraine. Caitlin.
So, Fred, he said he is suspending Russia's participation. That doesn't sound like he's saying they're fully pulling out. What are the implications of this? Why is he doing it? Is it because the U.S. wants to come in and inspect these military options in Ukraine? Or in Russia? Excuse me. What's the situation here? Yeah,
that was one of the reasons that was given, but there were various reasons that were given. On the one hand, he said, look, right now we have these sites in Russia. He doesn't believe that they should be inspected by the U.S. or by any sort of other outside entity, because he obviously believes that is something that could be detrimental to Russia in their campaign in Ukraine. He was specifically speaking about those places getting attacked. He then went on to say, look, it's one thing about having something to do with the United States, having an agreement with the United States, but what about France and the United Kingdom? They have nuclear weapons as well, and obviously he sees himself in a major conflict with the collective West, as he kept putting it. So he's saying, and he made clear to say this twice, that they are suspending their participation, but they are not going out of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty altogether at this point in time. He did, however, say that if the United States decides to develop or further develop any nuclear weapons, that Russia would then obviously do the same as well. So there is a clear warning in all of this. It is a pretty big decision on the part of Vladimir Putin to make, but certainly not one that he couldn't walk back from.
Thank you to Fred there. You told us that was going to happen, and that's exactly what happened in the speech. President Putin not backing down, in fact, being more aggressive. Let's go now to Clarissa Ward, who is in Ukraine for us in Kyiv. Obviously, this speech was had, and I'm sure it was being watched by the leadership there in Ukraine. What are you hearing from them?
Sarah, we've only heard reaction from one senior advisor to the presidency, Mikhailo Podolyak, but I'm sure it reflects the general thinking and the leadership here. He said, quote, Putin demonstrated irrelevance and confusion because everywhere there are Nazis, Martians, and conspiracy theories, really referring there to this kind of alternate reality that Putin appears to be presenting. He accused the Ukrainian government of being responsible for destroying the economy, destroying the lives of its citizens. He accused them of being responsible for starting the war. He accused them of paying more attention to the interests of the West than to the interests of their own Ukrainian people, really reflecting a sort of startling take on the actual events that we have seen transpire on the ground in the last year. He said, quote, talking about the Ukrainian government again, they unleashed the war and we continue to use force to stop it. This kind of thinking, this sort of alternative reality, I think really underscores why it is that the Ukrainian government has shown such reluctance to really sit down at the negotiating table with Vladimir Putin or with his emissaries and try to hash out some kind of a political situation. Because at this stage, it's clear that there's such a discrepancy in understanding and perspective on the war, and there's such a complete lack of respect for truth and for facts that the Ukrainians just don't believe there's any prospect of being able to take Russia at its word, even if it were to offer a more conciliatory approach. So while you won't see most people here on the ground focusing too much on Putin's speech today, I do think it's fair to say that the leadership will be offering as that this is classic evidence for why a political solution is just not feasible at the moment.
And that is the problem with lies. Clarissa, thank you so much. When you hear stuff like that from Putin, you can see why the Ukrainians say, he's not dealing in reality. We're not going to deal with him.
And we can't go to the negotiating table. There is no negotiation to have. Caitlin.
Yeah, it was quite a lengthy speech there from Putin. The White House, we should note, said President Biden likely was not watching it, but he will be updated on it. So for more on this, let's bring in CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger, who is also the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. David, so good to have you here in Poland with us. You were listening to Putin's speech, as I was, and you heard him say that they are suspending participation in that nuclear arms treaty. What does that say to you?
Well, first, Caitlin, what a remarkable 2 days to have the president in Kyiv yesterday, here today, and to hear Vladimir Putin a year into this with a narrative that still is living in sort of his own head here. I mean, as Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, put it to us earlier today, if the Russians pulled out of the war today, the war would stop. If the Ukrainians pulled out of the war today, Ukraine would just be absorbed into Russia.
Pushing back on what Putin has said, that this is because of the West, that
That's
this war is
right.
underway.
That somehow the West, was threatened him. And New START fits into this. So New START is the last remaining treaty arms control treaty between the United States and Russia. It covers the biggest weapons, the strategic weapons that go on ICBMs and that could hit the United States or other countries, or that could hit Russia. And under that treaty, both sides are supposed to be able to inspect the other to make sure that they are complying with the number of warheads that they can have, the deployment of strategic missiles, and so forth. Those inspections haven't happened in the past few years, first because of COVID, and then because the Russians would not allow the inspectors back in. What he has done now is said, I'm done with participating in this inspection thing. What he didn't say was that he's going to build more weapons beyond the 1,550 that are allowed. Now, the whole treaty expires in early 2026. And one of the big questions is this a Vladimir Putin who's even interested in having a follow-on treaty?
That's a worthwhile question.
David, you wrote last night that these vastly different worldviews that we're seeing on the world stage today between what Putin just said and what the president will say shows, quote, echoes of exactly what President Biden wanted to avoid, a replay of the worst days of the Cold War. The difference, though, of course, is the China factor, right?
Look at this one. That's right, Poppy. The China factor is a big element to this because in the Cold War, it was basically between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now we have a much larger third player, and that makes this a lot more complicated. It's also a player on whom we are dependent for technology, for a lot of trade. We were never in the Cold War dependent on the Soviet Union for key technologies. Every Apple iPhone that you pick up is made, or just about every one, is made in China. Think about that. Almost everything you see at Walmart, or much of what you see, is made in China. So this is a much more complicated dynamic. And that's why it's particularly important, Poppy, that we're seeing the top foreign affairs official in China in Moscow today, meeting, we think, with President Putin, certainly with other Russian officials, while the president is here giving his speech.
Well, Sarah, it was notable that just yesterday, President Zelensky told a German newspaper, essentially, if China does provide lethal aid to Russia, we're going to have a world war.
Right. And that is what has been the big concern here, because we're talking about nuclear powers now and world war. I do want to ask you, David, you talked about the importance of China. You talked about, where Russia stands and how we are all connected, whether we like it or not. I am wondering about what you think the possibilities are for Ukraine, assuming, let's say, that Ukraine ends up keeping its territory. Can they join the EU? Will they be given a position, for example, in NATO? Do you think that that is a possibility after all that has happened now in this scenario?
Well, there's a big argument, Sarah, about whether this would be a wise time to let Ukraine into NATO or not. Now, think about this. Ukraine is at war. If it became a member of NATO tomorrow, NATO would be obliged to enter that war directly. So far, it's been indirect. The United States, NATO countries have been providing arms, they've been providing intelligence, but they haven't been providing actual human forces. And President Biden has made it pretty clear that while he wants to support Ukraine, he does not want to risk World War III, as he puts it to his staff, and that means no direct conflict with the Russians. That would end if they entered NATO. Entering the EU would be a different thing, and you could make an argument that if you really wanted to support the rebuilding of Ukraine, you would bring them into the EU right away.
Jill Doherty, you have covered President Putin for, 20 years plus? And I wonder if you heard anything different from him this morning than you expected.
I wouldn't say it was very different. I mean, all of the criticism of the West was exactly what he said, kind of in one place. They're disgusting. He used the word cheating, hypocritical, disgusting. But I think what I did pull away from it is that he is bringing Russia back to the Soviet days. And what I mean by that is that he is bringing his society back. Everything that he described was government control and government help for industry. Young people need possibilities for some government programs. It was very much a Soviet idea. There was even one moment, where he said, we're producing X number of tons of grain. And I thought I was back in 1985. So I think it's a sad commentary, because right now, Putin, every problem that he talked about domestically is a problem that he has created because of this war in Ukraine. So the news, of course, is the New START agreement, and that's very disturbing because it not only suspends their participation right now, but it raises questions about where we are going. Will there be another type of arms control agreement or not? I think Putin showed his by this speech.
Jill, you are breaking up just a tiny bit. We got 99% of what you said, and you're always on the mark. You have been covering this for so long. I want to move now to CNN military analyst Spider Marks. I'm curious what you think it means. We know that Putin has not been following the rules of this treaty. But for him to state it out loud like this, is that an escalation somehow?
Well, he's made it very clear that he has nukes, which is certainly no mystery, right? I mean, all along he has said you're going to have consequences if you push too hard, which is really unnecessary. We know what the capabilities are of the Russian military, the nuclear capabilities. And going back to Jill's point, which I think is absolutely spot on, is you see this movement, this recidivist behavior, if you will, of Putin, where he's trying to recreate something that's been gone for 30 years. And when you look at it, you realize that this Russian military that he has put in the field to go against the Ukrainians has demonstrated itself to be an abject failure from top to bottom. It's a corrupt military. It's leaderless. It has no competence at any level. And every time it engages with the Ukrainians, it loses quite considerably. But what we need to take this very seriously, because the law of large numbers applies here. Russia, 3 times the population of Ukraine, can continue to conscript young men, put them into combat without the necessary training, obviously, and put this into this meat grinder. But that is the intent that we see from Moscow right now, which is to try to wear down not only Kyiv, but also to try to wear down the NATO alliance.
And Ambassador Taylor, I'm here in Warsaw, and obviously Poland has been a very vocal advocate for giving Ukraine what it needs. There's actually a protest outside where President Biden's motorcade is going to go by this morning that says, send Ukraine the F-16. That is something that the White House has so far resisted doing. They have said there's no plans to even train Ukrainians on fighter jets, this idea that was raised of training them in advance in case they do decide to give them to them. What do you make of that?
Caitlin, this is a trend. I mean, we see the United States thinking about providing weapons to Ukraine. They think about, for example, providing Stingers, anti-aircraft. And that was decided. They finally decided to do that. And now we're all the way up to Patriot missiles, the most advanced anti-aircraft that we've got. Same thing on the tanks. That is, we provided them javelins. First, we didn't provide them javelins. Then we decided we would. And now it's all the way up to HIMARS, these very advanced weapons, these rockets. So the trend is clear. My bet is that this discussion within the administration, within the NATO alliance, will soon lead to the decision to provide those F-16s as those polls are asking.
That's a really interesting perspective.
No, I think there's a little bit of delay. I was just saying that's remarkable. He does think that they'll ultimately send the F-16s.
Yeah, 100%. I was going to bring Clarissa Ward. I think we have Clarissa Ward, right? And so, Clarissa, just your response to that, hearing now, 24 hours after President Biden was on the ground in Kyiv, knowing that that is what Zelensky wants, is those F-16s and longer-range missiles. Is it the belief of the people of Kyiv and Ukraine that will ultimately come from the West?
I wouldn't say it's the belief yet. It's definitely the fervent hope. And I think that yesterday's visit from President Biden kind of stoked those dreams even further, particularly when you heard some slightly cryptic comments coming from the chief of staff of the presidency, Andriy Yermak, who said that some issues had been resolved and some things that were stuck would now be sped up. It wasn't clear exactly what he was alluding to there, but certainly when you talk to ordinary Ukrainians, the hope very much is that they could be talking about F-16s, that they could be talking about the kind of long-range missiles and artillery that they have been asking for, because Ukraine is sort of looking down the barrel right now at what promises to be a deeply unpleasant spring after a very grim winter, with some kind of a large-scale offensive, although we don't know exactly what that will look like, and there is some speculation as to how the Russians are actually, what kind of ability they have to launch that kind of an offensive. But Ukraine understands militarily that if outright victory is the goal, what they have as the status quo will not be enough to achieve that objective. So for them, they really view this as kind of an existential moment. We need this more sophisticated weaponry if we're going to finish this off, or else this conflict really risks sort of devolving into a protracted stalemate, war of attrition, with many more lives lost on both sides, and with Vladimir Putin ultimately trying to use that protracted conflict to create fissures in the West among those who support Ukraine.
And just to catch everyone up to speed, we are standing by here in Warsaw, waiting for President Biden to arrive at the presidential palace. He's going to be meeting with Polish President Duda, who has played a fundamental role since Russia invaded Ukraine in the response, not only the humanitarian response, but also when it comes to weapons and military. This place that you're looking at right now, the presidential palace, this is the same location where President Biden gave a speech last year, 1 month into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He gave a speech talking about what he believed the broader implications of the invasion meant, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia, not just for Eastern Europe, but really for the entire world. But it was a moment at the end of the speech that President Biden, a comment he made that really got everyone's attention. This was the moment. It was a moment that captured headlines worldwide. Ambassador Taylor, you watched that moment as well. You know just as well as I do. You know, the White House had to come out after and say they were not calling for regime change. The president said he did not have any regrets about that comment. I wonder what you're going to be listening for President Biden to say today in these remarks and in this speech.
Kate, and I imagine that he will be very clear about the U.S. goal. And the U.S. goal is to defeat the Russians and for a Ukrainian victory. He will also put this in a broader context. He will be able to say and describe how important this is for all of us. It's important for Ukraine, it's important for Europe, it's important for the United States that the Ukrainians win.
Joe, one of the things we heard from President Putin's remarks today also is a defense of the economy, because that has been a real question mark. I mean, we've seen what has happened to the Russian economy as a result. And he tried to make it appear otherwise, that the Russian economy has not suffered the way that we've actually seen it suffer on the world stage. Obviously, it's been propped up by some other players. Yeah. Sarah mentioned India and China, of course. But what's the reality when it comes to the Russian economy and the impact on the Russian people?
Well, it has been affected. Now, they've been able to overcome some of the dangers for the economy. But I think one really telling moment, and he went on at length about this, was the effect of the war and the body bags coming back from Russia. And so President Putin said, we're going to create a foundation, a national foundation that will help the families. Because, as he said, you know, I really almost feel their pain. He said it's tangible and we have to help them. And so what this says to me is he is obviously under pressure from the Russian people because of the people who are dying, their family members who are dying. And so this foundation is being created. I would say also, you know, he talked really about class warfare. He mentioned people who have, Russians, who have put their money, invested their money in the West. And he said, no ordinary Russian would have any pity for anyone who lost their yachts due to the sanctions. So again, what he was trying to say he was going to do was actually a reflection of the problems that he has right now. And you can see the personal problems of Russians right now creeping through in this speech.
Really, really interesting. The things he says he's going to try to fix are actually the things that are hurting the country right now, but he doesn't want to put it in those terms. We are going to come back to this amazing panel, our Brain Trust. But first, we're going to go to Fred Pleitgen, who is in Russia. And at this point, are we hearing any reaction from Moscow?
Hi there, Sarah. Well, there certainly has been a lot of reaction, first of all, to President Biden's visit in Ukraine. We've heard some of that from Dmitry Peskov earlier today. And just a couple of minutes ago, I actually got a press release from the Russian Foreign Ministry that they have now summoned the U.S. ambassador to Moscow here in a protest note against the U.S.'s involvement in Ukraine. I just want to read some of it to you really quickly, because all of this obviously moving very quickly. We had Vladimir Putin's speech. We have this now. One of the things they said is they say, in connection with the growing involvement of the United States in hostilities on the side of the Kiev regime. Of course, we heard in Vladimir Putin's address earlier today, him constantly calling the government in Kiev, the Kiev regime, also saying that he believed that the authorities in Kiev are alien to the actual Ukrainian people. That's something that the Russians have actually been spreading a lot. And they then go on to say, and I think this is quite important, they say that this clearly proves the inconsistency and falsity of the statements of the American side that the United States is not a part of the conflict. So the Russians are saying they believe that the United States is indeed involved in this war. And that's certainly one thing that Putin also made clear, that he believed that this was essentially Russia against the West. I want to listen into some of what Vladimir Putin had to say.
The elite of the West does not conceal their ambitions, which is to strategically defeat Russia. What does that mean? It means to finish us off once and for all, and to make local. They do that by making local conflicts into much wider and bigger ones.
So obviously a very long speech by Vladimir Putin. There's a couple of things that I also picked up on, which I actually thought was quite interesting. Vladimir Putin obviously repeatedly saying that Russia will persevere, that Russia will continue. One of the things we didn't hear from Vladimir Putin today is how he thinks things are actually going for the Russians on the battlefield, because obviously we know that has been very difficult. And of course, as far as the New START treaty is concerned as well, I found it quite interesting that he said that Russia is afraid that Russian bases could be struck by the Ukrainians. You'll recall, many people believe the Ukrainians managed to strike a base of the Russians inside Russia that had Russian strategic nuclear-capable bombers on them last year, guys.
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians could answer the question of how things are going for Russia, and 2 words: not well. Thank you so much, Fred. Caitlin?
And when I was listening to President Putin's speech earlier today, he made this comment about long-range weapons. Obviously, that is what Zelensky has been seeking. It seemed to be the most specific threat that we heard from Putin. And we're seeing here, I should note, that the president's motorcade, President Biden's motorcade, that is it right there. It is going down the streets of Warsaw. It's less than a 10-minute drive over here to where we are outside the presidential palace. That is where President Biden is going to be meeting with Polish President Duda. It'll be a formal greeting, as it was last year when there are the gathered troops that they will inspect before going behind closed doors. We'll get a brief preview of what that meeting looks like before the 2 leaders will sit down face to face to talk about the grave implications of what they are seeing, how they are responding, what Poland would like to see. Obviously, this is a country that has felt the weight of this invasion. They have taken in over 9 million refugees that crossed through Poland's borders. About 1.5 million, we believe, are still here actually in Poland. So that has been a huge aspect of it, in addition to what we're talking about here with weapons and what that looks like. And Spider Marks, when you heard President Putin say the longer range weapon systems, if they come to Ukraine, he says, quote, the further we will be forced to move the threat away from our borders. What is he saying there? What did you take away from that?
Well, what I think he is saying is that if longer range weapons are being deployed by the Ukrainians, in other words, if NATO and the United States step up and then increase the capabilities, what I think Putin is indicating is that he understands he's now at risk in sanctuary. That is to say, across the border into Russia, he now has capabilities that he is using to move forces in, where he stages forces, refits forces, prepares forces in sanctuary. Nobody's threatening him there. Then he moves them into Ukraine. What he's indicating is he may have to push those forces further back, which is exactly the type of effect you want to achieve in battle. You want to reach out as deep as you can and affect what is happening before it engages in that close combat.
Thing is, Caitlin made such a good point, pointing back to that March 2022 address where Biden went off script and said, he cannot remain in power, talking about Putin giving that address at the same place he will speak today. He also said last year in October of 2022, Biden did say that he believes that Vladimir Putin is a rational actor. 1 year into this war, do you believe his position has changed?
Poppy, is that a question for me? I'm sorry.
It is. Well, it's for Bill Taylor, Ambassador Taylor.
Sure.
Yes. I think President Putin is rational. Rational people can make mistakes. Rational people can make bad decisions on bad information. I don't think President Putin is crazy. I've not met this man, but a lot of people that I know have studied him for a long time. They don't think he is suicidal or crazy. He makes bad decisions. And it's increasingly clear that the original decision to invade Ukraine was a blunder. And he's now a year in from this blunder. He's trying to get himself out of this blunder. He's doubling down on this blunder, and it's not going well for him, as we've said.
I just want to note what we're seeing here. The motorcade has pulled up. We're watching it from our balcony here. right by the presidential palace. We're watching reporters scrambling to get in to capture this arrival. That you can see the Polish forces there. President Duda is right there waiting underneath the flags for President Biden to walk up for this meeting. It's remarkable what has changed and also what has not changed in the last 11 months since President Biden was here. And I also just think it's notable that he is here. He is not in Berlin. He is not in Paris. He is not in London. He has come here to Warsaw because Poland has played such a pivotal role in this. And that was not always a given. The relationship between the United States and Poland before this invasion there were concerns about Poland being on this rightward slide. There were concerns about the state media here, what that was looking like, their treatment when it comes to human rights. So much has changed of that in just the last 12 months alone since Russia invaded Ukraine, and the relationship of what Poland has done. Not only have they helped with the refugees, Sarah, you know that very well. You covered it on the ground as those millions of refugees were coming through Poland. But also they have served as the logistics hub for so many of the weapons that we've seen going into Ukraine. I mean, they have helped get all of that when it was quite difficult at the beginning to get so many of those weapons across the border into Ukraine, Sarah and Poppy.
Yeah, I can tell you just from the perspective of how the relationship has changed between the United States and Poland, because there were questions about human rights and certainly a slide to the far right there, although that sort of happened in this country as well, and many countries in Europe. But when it comes to the way in which Poland responded to the refugees, there was a moment when I was standing on the border in a town called Przemysl, and then we went to the border with Ukraine. And as we watched people walk over, they were coming over with their children in tow, holding them with one suitcase often. And the way in which they were received when they got to the other side was nothing short of beautiful. I mean, people were crying because they came into open arms. People just randomly set up shop and started cooking for the refugees on the border right after they passed through. And you saw that not just from the Polish government, but you saw that directly from the Polish people in a way I don't think I've ever seen it before with such numbers coming over. So it was a moment that really set the stage for how Poland was going to act towards Ukrainians and towards Ukraine.
That's a great point. Caitlin.